Talia set her wineglass down on the table and tilted her head at Reed like she was examining something she didn't think much of. He's the kind of man who just keeps his head down working and has no clue about the real world. The line dropped lightly, but it was enough to make the whole table laugh. Janet laughed so hard she had to put a hand on her chest. Walt nodded along, and Drew leaned toward Talia like her comment was some brilliant insight. I was the only one sitting still. Cold. Watching each person in this family like I was observing an experiment I'd seen too many times. Reed pressed his lips together, a small habit only someone who lives with him would notice. He didn't say anything, didn't react. But I saw his hand pull in under the table, like he was trying to cover the sudden hurt that had just been torn open in front of the people he calls family. Talia glanced at me with a faint smile, the kind that says she'd done nothing wrong, that she was only stating a truth. And what was worse, no one thought anything was wrong. They treated the jab like decoration on the dinner table. Like belittling Reed was some long-standing tradition they didn't have to think about. I kept my eyes on their faces for a few more seconds. Then I let out a quiet breath, with one clear thought in my head. To understand this, we have to go back to where it all began. My name is Marai. I work in social psychology research at a small community center in the suburbs. My job is all about observing human behavior, measuring the things people tend to hide, what they show, and what they don't want anyone to see. Maybe that's why when I stepped into my husband's family, I saw clearly the things they thought they'd covered up. The throwaway lines meant to dodge responsibility. The laughs that were just a little too loud to mask insecurity. The moments when they looked at Reed like he was someone standing outside their idea of what a proper life should be. Reed couldn't be more different from them. My husband teaches mechanical skills to students at a trade school. His hands are covered in calluses, but the way he's patient with his students is something no one in this family has ever understood. Reed lives with so much responsibility that I've sometimes thought his shoulders tilt forward a little from the weight he takes on himself. He doesn't brag. He doesn't ask for anything. He doesn't like talking about himself, and he never wants to explain anything if doing so might bother someone else. That silence is exactly what made them misjudge him, or maybe they never tried to understand in the first place. Drew is the opposite. Reed's older brother works in real estate, the kind he likes to talk about as if it's one non-stop stream of wins. He talks loud, laughs loud, and always sits leaning back a little like he's trying to take up more space in the room. Drew is the kind of person people look at and think he's on the rise. And because Drew likes to project that image, he needs someone to stand below him. Reed, with his quiet, simple way of being, became the perfect target. And Talia, Drew's new girlfriend, is the kind of person I can understand within minutes. She likes to compete, but only with people she thinks she can beat. She likes to side with whoever holds the most power in the room. She likes to use sarcasm as a weapon, but only when she's sure it'll leave the other person speechless. Talia feeds on attention, and she knows how to get it by stepping on someone else. Tonight, that someone was my husband. This dinner scene wasn't the first time they'd done this. I knew that. I'd seen them repeat this pattern again and again, putting Reed down with jokes they claimed were harmless, asking questions designed to corner him, calling his kindness a lack of ambition. And when Reed stayed quiet, exactly the way he always lives, they took it as proof of everything they thought. And me, I observed. I kept track of every small behavior, every sideways glance from Talia, every self-satisfied nod from Drew, every laugh a little too loud from Janet, my mother-in-law. I didn't say anything, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see the whole picture before touching the exact point that would make it crack. They didn't know, or didn't care to know, that Reed's silence wasn't weakness. They had no idea he'd been carrying something they created, something he'd kept hidden for 2 years, as if he'd tucked it into his pocket. Never saying it, never showing it, never taking credit. Something that, if they knew, would force them to rethink the way they'd treated him. But tonight, when the laughter got too loud, when Talia decided she had the right to judge someone she hadn't even known for a month, I knew I wouldn't let them keep going. The moment they laughed, I made up my mind. I'd show them the thing they never once considered. Not to embarrass them, but to put my husband back in the place he deserves, the place they'd pushed him beneath for far too long. And the rest of the dinner was just the lead up to that. The air after Talia's comment in the previous part settled for a few seconds. Then dinner slid back into this family's usual pattern. Drew started talking about his recent trip to Miami, where he said he'd met all kinds of big investment people. Talia leaned into him, her voice so sweet it sounded like an ad. "You should tell everyone about your new deal. They'll be so impressed." Janet jumped in right away, asking non-stop about the five-star hotel and fancy restaurants. Walt, my father-in-law, nodded along like anything Drew said was automatically true. The whole conversation spun around them like a whirlpool meant to push anything unappealing off the table, and that person was always Reed. "Reed probably doesn't get any of this," Drew cut in mid-story, his tone half joking, half serious. He didn't even bother looking at his brother when he said it. Talia laughed immediately. "Well, he works a hands-on job. Simple thinking is normal for him." Janet covered her mouth, but the smile was still obvious behind her fingers. Walt even shook his head like, "That's right. That's right." Reed just set his knife down quietly, neat, without a sound. He wasn't annoyed and didn't push back. He kept that familiar silence. The one they treated like a label for, "doesn't know much." I watched every expression on their faces, every look that said they thought they had the right to judge, and I could see the unfairness growing with every word they threw out. Talia kept showing off that sharp-edged ego of hers. Reed had barely opened his mouth to comment on a dish when she cut in right away, not even caring what he was about to say. "Reed, you're not the type who goes out much, so how would you know any of this?" Her laugh was short and smug, light but enough to shove him back into the place she thought he belonged. Janet looked at Talia with a pleased expression, like someone had finally said what she'd always wanted to. She propped her elbow on the table and tilted her head. "Reed, that trade school of yours? Does it even still exist these days? Who goes to learn that stuff anymore?" Both the question and her tone carried something familiar, the kind of familiarity that comes from years of practiced condescension. Reed didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was too polite to respond to a question that clearly wasn't meant to understand anything. Drew sat there looking at Talia with this proud expression, like she just scored points by kicking someone else down. They matched in that way, always needing someone weaker to prove they were stronger. I took a slow breath. What I felt wasn't anger. It was something cold, sharp, clear like water at night. I looked at Talia, then Janet, and finally Drew. All of them were clinging to one single point, Reed's quiet nature. As if someone who doesn't talk much must have nothing inside. The little cuts kept coming, like someone was testing how much my husband could take. Talia looked at me with a smile that tried too hard to seem friendly. "Marai, it must be tough for you, living with a man as unambitious as Reed." The line landed lightly enough to ignore, if it weren't for the fact that the whole table burst out laughing a second later. Drew gave Talia a light tap on the shoulder, like congratulating her for saying exactly what he wanted her to. Each laugh hit the air like shards of broken glass. I didn't laugh. I didn't answer either. But my eyes turned colder, clear enough for anyone paying attention to notice, not because they insulted me, but because they spoke with such confidence about someone they didn't understand at all. And then, in the middle of all the jokes, a few important pieces slipped out. They mentioned how Drew helped the parents once before. They said it like every burden in the family had been handled by Drew. Janet said proudly, "Thanks to Drew, your father and I stayed stable that year. Having a responsible eldest son is always better." Talia nodded, looking at Drew like he was the only reliable man at the table. The way they talked made it clear. They truly believed Drew was the one who had saved the family. They believed it so strongly they didn't realize how wrong it was from the start. I stayed quiet, but in my mind, the pieces started connecting. The way Walt always avoided my eyes whenever finances came up. The way Janet quickly changed the subject whenever I asked about an old loan. The way Drew talked about his wins but never showed any proof. And most of all, the one time Reed told me, very quietly, "I need to take on more teaching hours to cover this month." When I asked why, he just said, "There's something I need to take care of. No more, no less. Not a single complaint." They had no idea what Reed had been quietly doing, and they'd never tried to find out. They clung to the story they wanted to believe, that Drew was the pillar, that Reed was the weaker one, that this family stayed afloat thanks to the more successful son. But the truth, the one I knew clearly, was that Reed had been carrying the family's debt for the past 2 years. He paid it slowly, consistently, carefully, making sure no one had to feel ashamed. And Drew? He only knew how to show off things that weren't his. I looked at the people sitting around the dinner table and understood. They'd lived inside their misunderstanding for far too long. And their confidence in that wrong version of reality was exactly what allowed them to belittle Reed without a hint of guilt. This dinner was peeling back the truth piece by piece. They were exposing themselves. Every word they said was building the foundation for the moment I knew would come. I didn't need to step in. Didn't need to rush. I just had to wait a little longer. Until they pushed themselves to the point of no return. The energy in the room felt like it was sliding into a deeper place. After every laugh, I could feel their confidence growing. This careless certainty that they truly understood Reed. They thought they knew who in this family was stronger, who was weaker. They thought they had the right to joke on the back of the kindest person at the table. And then Talia opened her mouth again, this time not with a light jab. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms like she was about to drop some important conclusion. "Reed," she said, dragging out his name like she was talking to a child. "If you had to handle anyone's finances, this whole family would be doomed." The line landed exactly where she meant it to, right on a wound none of them knew existed. The whole table burst out laughing instantly. Drew slapped his hand on the table from laughing too hard. Janet leaned back, delighted. Walt nodded because he thought the comment was so true. They didn't just laugh, they believed it, completely. Blindly. It wasn't until their laughter bounced off the chairs, echoed back, and turned into that hollow noise that I finally stood up. I stood up slowly, without making a sound. The chair slid back just a little. That alone was enough to make the whole family quiet down, not because they respected me, but because they were surprised. They weren't used to me stepping in. I rarely did. And because I rarely did, whenever I did, they had to pay attention. "Talia," I said softly but clearly, "listen until I'm done." She raised an eyebrow. Everyone at the table turned their eyes toward me. I opened my bag. My hands didn't shake, not fast, not slow, just steady enough to make it feel like I'd been ready for this moment for a long time. I pulled out a folded stack of documents and placed it on the table in front of Janet. "This," I said, "is what Reed has been keeping in his pocket to protect all of you." No one laughed anymore. Talia looked at the papers like they were something she didn't want to touch. Drew leaned forward, trying to see what it was. Walt frowned. Janet picked the papers up, her hands shaking just a little. I didn't need to say much. Just the truth. "This stack," I continued, "is a copy of the loan your parents signed 2 years ago." Janet swallowed hard. Drew sat up straight. Talia blinked twice, like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "The loan," I said clearly, "that existed because Drew's business failed and he pulled your parents into it. And if it wasn't paid on time, this house would have been put up as collateral." Not a sound. Even the silverware on the table seemed silent. I looked at each of them. No one dared to look back. "And the person who's been paying it off month by month," I went on, "is not Drew." Drew froze like someone had tightened a hand around his chest. Janet turned to him, stunned. Walt exhaled sharply, trying to save face but unable to hide his shock. Talia looked at me, then at Reed, then at the stack of papers. For the first time since she walked into this house, I saw confusion in her eyes. No sharpness, no smug confidence, just the truth closing around the jokes she'd thrown out so easily. Reed didn't say anything. He only sat a little straighter. Not proud, not trying to take credit, just relieved he didn't have to hide anymore. "Why?" Janet whispered, but she couldn't finish. I helped her. "Why didn't anyone know?" I looked around the table, because Reed didn't want anyone to feel ashamed. Talia opened her mouth, ready to say something, but I cut her off before she could make another foolish comment. "You said Reed couldn't handle finances." I looked her straight in the eyes. "But without him, this family would have lost the house last year." Her face went pale. Drew swallowed whatever excuse he'd been about to make. Janet's shoulders dropped. Walt stared down at the table like he'd just seen himself in the worst kind of mirror. A long silence settled over the room. In that moment, I realized they weren't just silent. They had nothing left to cling to. Every word they'd used to belittle Reed had just shattered under the weight of the truth. And I knew I had to say the final line, the one that would put everything back where it belonged. I looked at Talia, the one who mocked Reed the most. the one who threw the last jab that made me stand up. "If you want to laugh," I said, my voice low but sharp, "at least laugh at the right person." No one answered. No one dared. Dinner was no longer dinner. It had turned into a room full of truths they'd been avoiding for years. Truths Reed had hidden to protect them. Truths they had never deserved. And in that moment, as I looked at each face trembling under the sting of reality, I knew things had shifted. No one sat above Reed anymore. Not a single person. Janet was the first to break the silence. She set the papers down like they were something far too heavy for her to hold. Her voice trembled, though she tried to sound steady. "Reed, you didn't have to do that." It sounded like an apology, but it was really an excuse. As if her not knowing somehow made everything okay. As if their lack of attention could be covered up with a late, shaky surprise. Walt let out a long breath, his fingers laced together on the table. "You should have told us." He avoided looking at Reed, as if meeting his eyes would force him to face a responsibility he wasn't ready to carry. Drew opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. He swallowed, staring at the empty space behind Reed. I'm sorry. I didn't know." The apology had no weight, not because he meant harm, but because Drew had never looked directly at the truth about himself. And even now, he still couldn't. Reed stayed still, but his silence now was completely different. It wasn't the silence of endurance. It was the silence of someone who knew he was finally standing in the right place. The silence of someone who didn't need to defend himself because the truth had already done it for him. He didn't lower his head, didn't fidget, didn't rush to say it's okay to make anyone feel better. Reed simply looked forward and said one short, cold, clear line. "I did it for the family. No one needed to know." That sentence hit the center of everything they had misunderstood. Janet lowered her eyes. Walt stared at a tiny crack on the table, as if it mattered more than anything happening around him. Drew bit his lower lip, the embarrassment finally showing. Talia was completely frozen. She looked around as if searching for someone to lean on, but no one looked back at her. No one kept laughing with her. No one encouraged her to keep mocking. I let the moment stretch a few seconds longer. I wanted them to feel it fully. Then I spoke, calm and even, like I was reading the conclusion of a report. "The debt is almost paid off. Reed has taken care of most of it over the past 2 years." Talia's eyes widened, like I'd just said something impossible. I didn't give her a chance to respond. "If it weren't for Reed," I continued, "this family would have lost the house last year." The room was full of people, yet it felt hollow. They didn't look at me. They looked at themselves, and they hated what they saw. Talia swallowed. She tried to pull her image back together, using the softest voice she could. I was just joking." I turned to her. Not harsh, not angry, just the plain truth, sharp as a cut. Only weak people joke by stepping on someone else. Talia blinked, once, twice. No more laughter backed her up. No more eyes stood on her side. The room changed color. The air shifted sharply, from mockery to shame, from gloating to silence. Janet placed her hand on the papers as if she needed to confirm they were real. "Reed, I didn't know." Reed didn't answer. Not because he was angry, but because any explanation now was too late. Walt breathed unevenly, as if he had to adjust the way he'd seen his son for years. Drew tried to sit up straighter, but his back stalled. His pride had been snapped far too easily. Talia looked at Drew, hoping he'd say something to rescue her. But he avoided her eyes. He had no credibility left to protect anyone. He couldn't even protect the image he'd built for himself. I stood. The chair slid back with a small sound, but in that heavy space, it landed like a door slamming shut. I looked at the whole table, every face stripped of its arrogance. One by one, they were facing something they had never considered. The person they underestimated most was the one keeping this entire family standing. I didn't need to say anything else. They already understood. Reed looked up at me. His eyes didn't ask for thanks. They just held the calm he'd always had, the calm they never recognized. I stepped back from the table. Not fast, not angry, not shaking. I left because this part of the story was finished. Every truth that needed saying had been said. And Reed's place had returned to where it should have been, not because he fought for it, but because they were finally forced to lower their heads. As I turned away, I felt something unmistakable. It wasn't just Reed who had been seen clearly. The whole family was cracking. Not because of us, but because the truth they'd avoided had finally reached them. Cold, clear, sharp, undeniable. And I left them in that silence. They needed it more than we did. I walked away from the dinner table without waiting for a single explanation. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing worth hearing anymore. When the truth is laid out that clearly, every excuse becomes hollow. Reed stood up right after me. No sharp scrape of a chair, no sign of panic. He rose with a calmness that made it feel like he was finally stepping out of a room far too small for his kindness. The way he followed me wasn't to escape. It was to show he was choosing to stand with me without needing anyone's permission. Behind us, Janet's voice broke the silence first, a little higher than usual, like she was trying to hold on to something that no longer belonged to her. Marai, wait. I didn't stop. Then came Walt's voice, shaky but trying to sound steady. Reed? We didn't mean to. I could hear both fear and shame tangled in it. The fear of someone realizing they'd been wrong for far too long. The shame of someone who only understands another person's worth after being forced to face the truth. As we neared the door, Drew finally spoke. Reed, I didn't know it turned into a burden for you. I'm sorry. The apology landed like something dropped on the floor, audible, but unable to fix anything. Talia didn't apologize at all. She just breathed fast, like she was trying to find a place to stand, but every chair had already been pulled out. She called my name so quietly it sounded like wind, with none of the confidence she'd had just hours earlier. I paused for a beat. Not to let them catch up, but so I could turn back once, just once. I turned around and looked directly at the entire table, at everyone sitting and standing. From that angle, every face wavered with the same expression, the realization that they had created this moment themselves. My voice was low and clear. If this is how a family treats the best person in the house, I'm not staying to watch more. No raised tone, no accusation, no harshness, only the truth. And truth is always strongest when spoken calmly. I looked at each of them for one more second, then I turned away. Reed placed his hand on my back, light as a breath, a silent gesture, but heavier than anything they had ever thrown at him. We walked out the door. No one followed. No one tried to stop us. Maybe they knew they couldn't. Maybe they were afraid of what else they might hear. Or maybe, for the first time, they understood that Reed had given them far more than they ever deserved. Outside, the cold air brushed my face, a reminder that the world beyond that kitchen was wider and clearer than anything inside it. Reed opened the car door for me. There was no exhaustion in his eyes, only the quiet I'd always known. But tonight, that quiet carried strength. He drove without asking if I was okay. He knew I didn't need that question. I looked at him, his hand on the wheel, steady, the same way it always was when he worked in the shop. But there was something different now. Something lighter, as if the weight he'd hidden for 2 years had finally been given room to breathe. I reached over and took his hand. Not tightly, not to comfort him, just to make one thing clear. You're not alone. Reed looked at me, his eyes steady and deep, as if he heard that line in the truest way. Not as a promise, but as a fact. We drove away from that house. No need to talk about the people still inside. No need to check the rearview mirror. Some doors only need to be closed once, and closed cleanly. I leaned back in my seat, watching the streetlights slide across the car window. Something inside me settled, not relief, but the quiet that comes after doing what needed to be done. I told the truth. They were forced to see themselves. Reed was placed back where he deserved to stand. No arguments, no speeches. Just the truth and leaving. When people get too used to standing above someone else, they forget who's been holding them up all along. And sometimes the strongest way to remind them is to walk away from the table. Steady, cold, and final. I looked over at Reed again. He was watching the road, but I could tell he felt the shift, not in his family, but in himself. And I knew this. We didn't leave because of how they treated him. We left because we don't need to stay in places where kindness is mistaken for weakness. Sometimes strength isn't in arguing or fighting back. It's in standing up at the right moment and walking away at the right time. Kind people aren't weak. They're quiet until the truth speaks for them. And when you choose to protect the person you love with calm, that's the classiest victory there is. This is where the story ends. Thank you for staying with me until the last moment. If you've ever gone through something like Marai and Reed, would you stay silent or stand up? Leave a comment. I'd love to read your story. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for being here and supporting this. Your presence truly means a lot.